Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And thanks for attending this rather topical 45 minutes on session for ASI. Geopolitical risks facing the global aluminium supply chain in 2025 and beyond. One may say these are tumultuous times, and one could also argue that the current moments are pretty significant when it comes to geopolitical risks. 4 or 5 years ago, we had a singular issue, the global pandemic in COVID, but since that has eased, other major geopolitical issues have arisen, and it's a most interesting time. And this is also presented by the number of attendees for today's session. There's a big turnout today, so that also highlights how topical this issue is for us all. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our two speakers for the day from the Control Risks Group. Firstly, Vincent Rouget, who's a principal and heads Control Risks Political and Business Risk Analyses team for the Sub-Saharan Africa Group. And also joining him too is Gabriel Brasil, who's a Senior Analyst, and he specialises in ESG due diligence and also energy risk as well too. So thanks both to Vincent and Gabriel for presenting for us today.
Thank you, Cam, and good morning, good afternoon to everybody joining us this morning. Thanks very much, ASI, for inviting us along for this session. We're very excited to be presenting you our Risk Map 2025. For those of you who don't know Control Risks, we are a global risk consultancy. We work around the world with about 40 offices worldwide. We've been doing this for 50 years, but I think as Cam, you mentioned, it is absolutely fair to say that geopolitics has completely shot up to the global attention and to the work that we do over the last few years. You'll find a number of business surveys where geopolitics as a topic has risen to the top. I think some of the latest mining surveys very much confirm that trend. And we're finding more and more organizations that have a multinational footprint are grappling with many questions, from how to deal with the pandemic to how to deal with multiple wars, growing trade restrictions, and finding that the environment to do international business has become more and more complicated. We are helping companies understand these geopolitical fractures and as they relate to their business or their industry. In Control Risk has a team of analysts that work around the world, covering different regions of the world and then the global geopolitical trends to help businesses do that. Every year, we release our survey of global geopolitical trends for the year ahead. And this is what we'll be presenting today. We've been calling it Risk Map for many years. And in fact, you can look on our website and you'll find a risk map of 1975, where we were looking at political and security risks around the world back then. We still are 50 years later. And if we can move to the next slide, you will see what is available on our website, which is a map of country risks at a country level, where essentially we take a view on political, security, regulatory, operational obstacles to doing business safely, doing business responsibly around the world. So we update this every year, and that's a moment where our team of about 100 analysts comes together to form a view on the kind of pressing challenges and pressing business issues that companies from different sectors and origins are likely to encounter in the year ahead. So what you have on the slide here is our 2025 risk map. We released it at the end of November, ahead of the new year. And what we typically do along with the risk map is think and form a view of some of the top global risk issues that businesses should be aware of in the year ahead. And we call it colloquially our top 5 risks, and that's what Gabriel will walk you through now. Essentially, they are fairly cross-cutting issues that have resonance for businesses from different industries. What we are doing today is presenting that to you, but also trying to draw the relevance on the aluminium supply chain and the different regions that are the most concerned by the industry. So Gabriel will walk you through our top 5 for about 15 minutes. And as we are respectively regional specialists as well of Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, we'll do a bit of a focus for Africa on Guinea, given its centrality in the bauxite supply chain. And then for Gabriel, we'll talk you through some of the hotspots in Latin America as well.
How have you found the last 6 to 12 months, Vincent, with respect to your clients and general questioning? Has there been an elevation in the number of queries and concerns they've had? Has it been pretty stable? Are you seeing certain areas that are really quite specific to certain sectors? Is there any sort of trends coming, or is it just a lot of noise at the moment?
They are, and I guess, you know, the last 6 months has really been dominated by the run up to the US election and then the aftermath of the US election and now the inauguration. But I think that in itself has brought a bit more of attention on the wild cards, the surprises, the shocks that can come up. And we see more and more businesses coming to us, not just for a view of what is the most likely in geopolitics, but also what is potentially the most disruptive and, you know, what could catch us unprepared. And I think that is a bit of a product of the succession of crises we've had, from the pandemic to the war in Ukraine, to various elections outcome that maybe not would have been predicted, that people are working that through and being like, okay, what's the next thing that can hit us? But over to you, Gabriel, to talk us through the top 5 first.
As Vincent said, we are here to talk first about what we call the top 5 risks, which are related to trends, developments across different topics that we are seeing with direct implications for businesses globally. As we know, geopolitics is quite an interesting topic from an academic, intellectual perspective. Many people, particularly in the past few years, following closely, but we do need, as a business, of course, to focus on the business implications. So when we talk about geopolitical risk on the back of the top 5 risk assessments that we do, we're talking about things that will have political, regulatory, operational, security, and other direct implications for businesses. I will go through one by one, if you bear with me in the next 15 minutes. With no spoilers, the 5 are the ones you can see on the screen right now. A couple of considerations. Number 1 is that we developed those, as Vincent said, before the end of the year, and it was even before the US elections. And we were still comfortable after the Trump election in November with the risks that we chose, including the number 1, which you can see, which is called the uncertain states of America. And that's because the trends that we are seeing in geopolitics, they precede Trump. They will obviously be impacted by the new Trump administration, but they were already a regular or prominent feature of the geopolitical environment before that election. We would have kept the same risks in the event of a Harris administration. The other consideration, looking at these 5 risks that one might make, is that we don't have a specific square for climate risks. That's obviously a significant one for businesses around the world. And the reasons for that are basically 2. Number 1, we struggled to find a 2025 specific link to climate risk, as this is a phenomenon that is intensifying every year for the past decades. And number 2, we actually see climate risk as a threat multiplier. So basically, pretty much every political, regulatory, reputational, and operational risk that we see across the countries we cover around the world will have some exacerbation impact by climate. So that kind of goes without saying, but of course, it also deserves a separate discussion, which we can take at a separate moment. Without further ado, if we could please move to the first one, which are calling the uncertain states of America, and the next slide, please. This is a story of a country with declining influence. Again, this is not a Trump-specific phenomenon. This is something that we've been observing for the past few years on the back of a couple of trends. Number one, a reduced interest by the US population in having the US as a global power broker. It's not by coincidence that Trump's main agenda is called America's First. This is a country that will be looking inwards in the coming year, and that obviously comes with significant geopolitical implications because it is still the most significant superpower in terms of economics, defense, technology, and so on. So that's the overarching aspect of this risk. But then if we deep dive to more specific considerations, I think number two will be the fact that geopolitics will be significantly marked by the growing competition between US and China. Many of you will have seen yesterday the significant impacts on financial markets by the DeepSeek development, which I think it was a very symbolic illustration of how the US and China competition will impact different sectors. It's a priority for both administrations. And if we look at the US, it's probably one of the few consensus across both Democrats and Republicans. So definitely something that would have happened under Harris, but will happen and at a even more rapid pace under a second Trump administration. We will likely see under Trump a country that is way more transactional. This is a politician whose political approach, as you know, is mostly based on deal making and selling deals and brokering deals and using that as his main political platform, as opposed to what we had with Biden and other administrations, which was an approach much more based on multilateralism and consensus-based negotiations and working with allies, that type of thing. That, of course, will help produce what we think will be the main story of geopolitics in 2025, which is a story of volatility. If we look at Trump's first moves in the past week, he has already caused some shocks with some tariff threats. Of course, we don't know exactly what are his plans in terms of the specific tariffs and the time frame for them, but we know that they will be used not only as an economic tool, but as a diplomatic tool, which is also a shift from previous administrations. So that's on the US role in global affairs, more transactional, not necessarily more isolated, but definitely looking at its national interests first. Of course, it's still a significant powerhouse economically, so it will continue to present significant business opportunities domestically, but those will be threatened to some extent by what we are seeing in the country, or I'll have many colleagues there, in terms of political polarization, political dysfunction, and the fact that we have a new administration that has different focuses in comparison with the last 4 years, particularly around things like the energy transition, trade, and democracy consolidation elsewhere, and so on. Finally, just before we move to the next risk, another key implication that is always worth highlighting is the overall weakening of multilateralism on the back of what I just said about his transactional approach. Trump has already announced that he will pull the US out of the Paris Agreement. He also has plans to pull the US out of the World Health Organization. That, of course, undermines the trust of civil society in these institutions. By the way, trust levels that were already low due to the lack of results delivered by such organizations in certain challenges in the past few years. And a result of that, which will have, of course, business implications, will be that shared or collective challenges, including a potential new pandemic, of course, climate change, immigration, they will be more complicated to fix if we don't have the right multilateral forums or for countries to work on together. Finally, on the aluminium world, what does this mean to aluminium companies and aluminium supply chains? I think the most significant implication of the new U.S. administration or the new U.S. role in the world will be this domestic focus, which will likely include, in addition, of course, to tariffs, other aspects of industrial policies such as subsidies, and we have already seen in the past few days a more conflicting relationship with partners like Canada, which we understand to be a significant aluminium player as well. Speaking of trade, that's actually our second risk. If we could please move to the next slide. This is also a trend that precedes Trump. It was, of course, exacerbated by his first administration, but it continued under the Joe Biden administration, and we think it will intensify in 2025. If we could please move to the next slide. We see three underlying factors driving what we're calling the global trade war. Number one, of course, a more protectionist stance by the US, but number two and three, equally important, a overcapacity in China. So we have a massive powerhouse with significant appetite for exports across different sectors, including mining. That triggers protectionist stances around the world. It has triggered, and that's connected to number three, which is the fact that industrial policies are cool again. I think China contributed to that, and now we have developed economies with pro-business administrations not being ashamed of introducing export restrictions, investment restrictions, local content requirements, resource nationalism initiatives, and so on. So I think this combination of three factors will continue in 2025, and again, for the aluminium world, that means trade volatility, that means a reconfiguration of supply chains. Obviously, once a country is impacted by tariffs, let's say by the US, they will look for other partners, and other partners will do that preventively as well. And we will see different trade relationships likely emerging as a result. I happen to be an economist, and I have to say, so economists disagree in all sorts of things, but economists do agree on one thing, probably, and it's hard to think of others, but they do agree that trade is normally inflationary. So tariffs are bad for monetary policies to the extent that they create inflationary pressures. And that, of course, is also a significant risk for businesses if we have the ongoing disinflation process that, by the way, has been somewhat successful in the past 2 years, being threatened by a tariff escalation. The business environment will suffer. We will have higher interest rates being priced, and investment projects being impacted as well. So that was our number two. If we could please move to the next slide, which is on political violence. This is probably the least direct one if we think of aluminium or the mining sector specifically, but it's still significant geopolitically because it is a considerable trigger for what we could call geopolitical anxiety and social anxiety. If we could please move to the next slide. I think there are a few factors underlying this trend. Number one, geopolitical competition. As I mentioned, the US and China competition is probably the overarching trend in geopolitics right now. Then political polarization, which is something that is not exclusive to the US. We've seen that in Brazil, in the UK, and emerging, pretty much everywhere in different levels. On the back and directly related to online radicalization, I think that's not a recent trend, but certainly one that has had significant political implications around the world. And number four, emerging technologies. As a risk consultancy, we always keep an eye on security trends. And something that we've seen, again, around the world is the use of things like low-cost drones or even 3D printed weapons in the context of political violence. And we don't see this trend being reversed in 2025. On the contrary, it's likely to intensify. If we think of more high-profile events, of course, we had 2 assassination attempts targeting Trump in the US, but again, that's not exclusive to the US. We had similar cases happening in countries like Slovakia, Pakistan, Japan, Argentina, and many others. And that just thinking of, a tier 1 political leaders, if I can put that way. In parallel to that, we have Islamist extremism, terrorism, which remains on our radar, even if counter-terrorism capabilities have improved. We still see, and we've seen sadly in the past few weeks, for example, in Germany with that incident on the market, on the Christmas market, cases here and there that will again feel geopolitical anxiety, and it will feel this sentiment of less cooperation and more protectionism and nationalism, which is generally not great for economic integration, trade flows, and for investment. Then if we could please move to the next one. This is also not directly related to aluminium, but it impacts businesses across the board. And I think the best example, very tangible one that we had recently was that of CrowdStrike last year, as you may remember, when the system went down, and that caused multi-billion-dollar losses, not only for direct clients of CrowdStrike, but other businesses as well. Of course, that was sort of an accident. And that triggered us into thinking, what if it happened as an incident or deliberate attack? If we could please move to the next slide. Basically, this comes on the back of this significant concentration of data companies or tech companies for different services, particularly things like cloud computing, data centers, things that we don't necessarily see because they're not that user facing, but that hold a significant disruption capacity. And because they hold a significant disruption capacity, they could become a preferred target for threat actors, including state and non-state actors. In the aluminium or commodities world, I think the main implication is supply chain disruption. Maybe a big company in the aluminium space will not be targeted, but a financial service partner will be, and trade or other related services will be down. Of course, that comes with costs for pretty much everyone. Again, because of geopolitical competition, this is more important than ever, I'd say. If we think of the episode yesterday with financial markets reflecting the DeepSeek emergence in the AI space, I think we have a clear picture of how tech is important for geopolitical competition, and therefore how how concentration becomes a problem, if we can put it this way, from a risk management perspective. Last but not least, and I know I've spoken a lot already, but if we could move to the next slide, we have what we call the red line geopolitics risk, and to the next slide, please, as well. I think the best one the best metaphor I normally use to describe this risk is the boiling frog. I don't know if everyone will remember that one, but it's basically the story of a frog that is put in a pan with water, and the water starts boiling, and the frog doesn't feel it because it boils gradually, but then when it realizes it's getting hot, it's just too late. And I think that's probably a good illustration of the world right now. We've been pushing thresholds in the past few years to the point that now when a president says they want to annex Canada or Greenland, that is not seen as a complete absurd. People still entertain the conversation because we have normalized so many developments in recent years from that changed the order of country relationships, multilateral dynamics, business agreements, and so on. That now we don't know exactly what are the red lines, what will be the ultimate escalation. Of course, there are a few flashpoints for businesses to monitor that we wanted to flag. Number one, of course, the Ukraine-Russia war, which, by the way, we don't think will be sorted in the coming months. So we just published a piece on that in case you're interested. We don't think that Putin is particularly interested in signing an agreement, but anyway, just a side conversation. That's one major flashpoint that will persist in 2025. All things Middle East, with the tit for tat escalation between Israel and Iran, and of course as well the tensions in the South China Sea, particularly around Taiwan. We don't necessarily see escalation scenarios for these flashpoints as likely events for 2025, but both the tit for tat and the rhetoric around them will trigger some sort of volatility from a geopolitical perspective that will have some impacts on markets. And we know that when there is geopolitical volatility, commodity markets are the first to feel. That these are markets that have that are very price sensitive. They're heavily traded 24 hours a day. They're quite related in the case of aluminium and mining. They're directly related to energy, which is well known as a geopolitically strategic sector. So we think that those attempts by different actors to push some risk thresholds and some red lines will make 2025 a bumpy year for trade and ultimately aluminium. I spoke a lot. I hope this made sense as a summary of how we're seeing the world this year. Again, this will be a story of volatility, of geopolitical anxiety, of countries looking at their own interests as opposed to shared challenges. And companies will likely struggle to navigate first the immediate implications of things like sanctions and tariffs, but second, the long-term strategic challenges they have in issues, for example, around climate change. I'll pause here and hand over to you, Vincent, so maybe we can start the regional overviews and with you for a Africa discussion, if that's okay.
Great, thank you, Gabriel. So Gabriel has given us very much the 36,000 foot overview of what we see in the world as global defining trends. We're now going to spend a little bit of time, and I'm mindful of time, talking some of the key at country level choke points and kind of specific areas to look for. And when it comes to Africa, I mean, there's only really one country to mention, as I'm sure you're aware, it is Guinea. Guinea accounts for 32% of the global supply of bauxite and was by far the dominant source of Chinese bauxite imports, well ahead of Australia with about 70%, I think, over the course of last year. So there is a clear choke point there. And the view from our West Africa team on Guinea is that, yeah, we are looking at potentially a fragile situation later this year in Guinea. For those of you who may not be so familiar with it, we are now into the 4th year of a military regime that took over in a coup in September 2021 that has sort of maintained stability, but it has not been a plain sailing. Last year, we had the army or former army chief of staff being killed in very dubious circumstances, to say the least. We had the main and the only fuel storage depot in the capital exploding about a year and 2 months ago. We also had a raid on the prison. All this to say, the regime is hanging, but is hanging by a fairly thin thread. And it's going to approaching crunch time this year, where we're likely to see elections to mark the end of the transition back to civilians. We're meant to have elections on a new constitution, a referendum first, and then likely towards the very end of this year, potentially a beginning of 2026, an election that would determine the future president. There is little doubt that if there is an election, the current military ruler, Doumbouya, will likely win. But we think that this will further stretch tensions within the armed forces. And so don't be surprised if you see rumors of coups, potential reshuffles, those kinds of political instability coming out of Guinea in the year ahead. The bauxite industry so far has been spared much of that disruption. And if anything, I think there's two maybe more structural trends that have affected it a little bit more. One is a really tense environment around labor, and we expect this to get worse this year with the regime having very difficult relationship with civil society and labor unions. And the second being a longer trend is that Guinea is increasingly tightening, turning the screw on foreign companies to try to get alumina refineries built in country to extend the aluminium value chain and produce more value-added product. We've had several agreements signed for refinery. We still don't think that Guinea is going the way of Indonesia in implementing a full export ban on raw materials, but we see more and more this year, next year, heading towards 2027, 2028, the potential for export restrictions or quite difficult conversations between mining operators and the government. We already have had some export restrictions, as I'm sure you know, imposed from October this year. And if some of the alumina projects don't progress as quickly as the government would like it to be, there is likely to be more of that disruption. The main challenge, and I suppose reason for patience until now from the government side, was the lack of reliable energy supply. But that excuse is increasingly wearing thin on the part of the government and doesn't seem to be really willing to countenance further delays. So Guinea is clearly one to watch given its role in the supply chain, and we would not be surprised if there were further supply shocks, mostly temporary rather than a real crunch on a long period, but still pretty disruptive to the industry in the year ahead.
Thank you, Vincent. If I may jump in now with some Latin American trends as well, and conscious of the time, obviously we're going to take some questions at the end. I will be very quick, and I think Latin America, I'm happy to talk Argentina, during Q&A, but I think it is mostly a tale of two countries, namely Brazil and Mexico. Brazil, I think, as some of you might be following, is a country that overcame some of the instability that we saw during the previous administration in terms of institutional relationships between the executive and other branches of government, but it's still a country that is facing volatility particularly due to fiscal challenges. So I'd say that for aluminium and trade, specifically the main risk is economic, and more specifically on the volatility of the Brazilian currency, the real. Markets are pricing that the government is not being able to address the country's long-standing fiscal imbalances. This has driven a significant anxiety in the past 5 to 6 months, and so far the government has given limited signs that it will change course and implement a more robust fiscal package. On the contrary, it seems that the President Lula administration has decided to bring to 2025 the discussions about the elections next year, which is not great for businesses. We tend to see when that happens, governments adopting a more short-termist view to economic policy making, as opposed to a more significant appetite for much-needed reforms. It's still a pro-business, pro-mining, pro-exports, pro-trade, with some caveats, but pro-business in the sector administration, but a business will continue to be impacted by that. A second important consideration regarding Brazil is on ESG and all things social environmental risks. And that's because, of course, mining in Brazil has a history of high impact, and scrutiny has remained elevated in the past few years, particularly regarding safety, but also environmental degradation. This is an agenda that is important for the current administration. So even if it's not always a priority, we will sometimes see issues regarding licensing and reputational backlash being a risk for businesses. Finally, in 2 minutes before we open the floor for questions, Mexico, I think the main issue there, and we've touched on that already during the top 5, is on trade and the relationship with the US. I think as a starting point, we have the Claudia Sheinbaum administration has a considerable capacity to handle Trump. If we look back at his first term, Emilo, who is part of the same coalition, had actually a good relationship with Trump, but that might change, particularly as Trump starts implementing his tariffs and adopts a more aggressive stance vis-a-vis the border. We do have as a difference between Biden and Trump in terms of foreign policy, the fact that Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State in the US, cares about Latin America. He's the son of Cubans, if I'm not mistaken, and he might prioritize Latin America more than other administrations. I think what needs to be seen is to what extent this will go beyond immigration. If that will include things like economic integration, technology partnerships, and so on. So far, signs are very limited, and countries are still, holding tight to see where they will need to react. We had a few bumps already with Colombia 2 days ago. I'm sure that the entire region watched that quite closely when President Gustavo Petro had a very public tension dispute with Trump over immigration. But so far, nothing very conclusive on how the region will react to the new administration in the US. Thank you very much for listening, and camera over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Gabriel, and thanks, Vincent, for both of your great presentations, very insightful. A few questions have come in there across here on my desk just to pass the last 3 or 4 minutes before we wrap up today's session. This might be one for you, Gabriel, but energy security, any sort of hotspots that you see might be about to simmer or explode with respect to energy security and also with respect to reliability. Me being Australian here too, there's always an ever-present question around energy reliability and security here. South Africa, it's ever-present in Southern Africa. Are there any sort of other areas, particularly to the aluminium supply chain, where energy security in the short term could be a real risk for the supply chain? Are there any that are coming out for you?
That's a good one, Cameron. I think the main trend behind energy security that we are seeing now is a shift. If we think of the traditional energy trilemma between energy security, energy affordability, and energy sustainability, it is definitely the deprioritization of by the US of energy sustainability, and that will drive price shocks or price volatility across the supply chain. I can't think of specific flashpoints right now in terms of country-specific trends, but I do, and based on some client work that we've done and some trends we've been monitoring, I do see, I'm very concerned about the impacts of climate change and extreme weather events to things like electricity grids, power generation, and how that may affect implementation plans for new projects. I also fear that changes in relative prices for renewables because of the US focus on fossil fuels might be negative, might send negative signs for long-term oriented projects that have a focus on energy security in places like Latin America and Africa, if that makes sense.
Yes, Gabriel. One around, you talked about infrastructure attack, ports, canals, deep sea cables, pipelines, and so forth. What's the situation with respect to the two big canals, Suez and Panama? Because obviously they have massive ramifications on global shipping, i.e. bauxite, alumina, primary metal, etc., etc. So what's the status of those two? They both have sort of been in the media the last 4 or 5 years with respect to little blow-ups, and the Houthis certainly in with the Suez and so forth. But where are those two sitting at the moment with respect to them being flashpoints?
That's a great one, and Vincent, please feel free to jump in as well. And just, I don't want to sound commercially too pushy here, but we do have a maritime team that is dedicated to maritime issues, and they've been working nonstop to address this exact type of question. From my end, and again, this will be very superficial. I think in terms of the Panama Canal, we still don't know to which extent Trump's threats will be a priority, or just Trump's approach to distract people from all the things he wants to push for, but definitely a risk that one should not lose sight of because of, as you say, the ramifications. In terms of the Middle East, Vincent, I don't know if you'd like to jump in, but we do not see an escalation now as a likely scenario for the relationship between Iran and Israel. But that's the type of risk that, because of the quantity of threat actors and different incentives in that region, is something that can happen even if things are not likely. Vincent, don't know if you have any thoughts, particularly on the Middle East one.
I mean, just very quickly to say, yeah, we don't see the kind of a complete, obviously, eradication of the Houthis anytime soon, and so this threat very much persists on the Suez Canal, and like the kind of selective targeting of vessels. We've seen various reports around different nationalities of ships, obviously not being targeted in the same way, and kind of that skewing the trade patterns as well. With certain payments or certain ways of kind of having protection arranged from these attacks. Either way, and no matter how Iran is weakened, the Houthis will remain a threat, at least for the better part of this year.
Right, thanks, Vincent. One last question before we wrap up. We have gone 2 minutes over time. Just one last question that's just come in. The overall risk, I guess the context here is the risk with respect to the aluminium supply chain of the US pulling out of the Paris Agreement. Gabriel mentioned that up front, but the overall risks that you see, if any, at this stage.
Yeah, I think the main implication of at least in 2025 of that development is symbolic. It fuels distrust by civil society on multilateralism as a tool to address common challenges. We don't know as of yet how Trump will position himself. Maybe he will try to push for another type of deal, something to replace the agreement. That's not a likely scenario, just brainstorming here. But it definitely sends a bad signal to private sectors, to the private sector in terms of the direction of travel by the US in terms of energy and decarbonization overall. We've seen some of the big, some of our clients, including are already adapting their decarbonization plans on the back of the US approach to that. So definitely it's not great news for companies with sustainability products that depend on relative prices, particularly in technologies that are not that mature. I'm talking wind and hydrogen, for example, that still need some sort of preferential funding or large contracts to be feasible in the long term.
Great, thanks, Gabriel. Well, I think we could talk for a lot longer than this, but I'm going to wrap it up now. And I'd like to thank Gabriel and Vincent for their time today. It was a great presentation, and I urge all of you to have a look at Control Risk website. Some great resources there, some free ones. There's also some even better resources after you perhaps chat to Vincent, Gabriel, or colleagues of them. They have been around 50 years. They know what they're talking about with respect to risk. So by all means, have a chat with them if yourself and or your company need some specialist risk advice. I forgot to introduce myself at the front, so I'll do it now. I'm Cameron Jones, Director of Assurance and Risk for ASI, and it's been a pleasure hosting you all today, and look forward to the next 45-minute on session by ASI. So again, thanks to Vincent and Gabriel, and wishing you all a good day and evening. Thank you.